Breaking news out of Ottawa. President Trump just proposed a $2.1 trillion infrastructure partnership with Canada, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's response has sent shockwaves through Washington. We're talking about the largest cross-border economic proposal in North American history, a deal that would reshape everything from energy grids to water systems, and Canada just delivered a rejection so calculated, so strategic, that it's forcing the White House to completely recalibrate its approach to bilateral relations. In the next 12 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly what Trump demanded, why Canada's refusal involved China and the European Union, and how this moment represents a fundamental shift in North American power dynamics. Here's the question that should terrify policymakers in Washington. What happens when your closest ally decides they have better options? Let me paint you the picture. On January 20th, 2025, just hours after his inauguration, President Trump directed his infrastructure team to draft what he called a generational partnership proposal for Canada. According to documents obtained by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the proposal called for a $2.1 trillion joint investment over 10 years, split 60-40 between the United States and Canada. The framework included integrated energy infrastructure, shared water management systems, coordinated transportation networks, and what the White House termed critical mineral extraction partnerships. On January 21st, 2025, Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick flew to Ottawa for what was supposed to be a ceremonial presentation. Instead, according to the Brookings Institution's North American Policy Program, the meeting lasted exactly 47 minutes before Canadian officials requested a recess. On January 22, 2025, Prime Minister Trudeau convened an emergency cabinet session that included not just his ministers, but representatives from the Bank of Canada, Export Development Canada, and senior advisors from the Privy Council office. The Yale Budget Lab, which has been tracking cross-border infrastructure proposals since 1994, noted that this was the first time in modern history that a sitting Canadian government had assembled such a comprehensive economic review team in response to a U.S. proposal. And on January 23, 2025, at 2:15 p.m. Eastern Time, Canada delivered its response. Not a rejection, not a counteroffer, but what the Council on Foreign Relations is calling the most sophisticated geopolitical pivot in Canadian history. So how exactly does this work? Think of it like this. Imagine you're a homeowner and your neighbor, who's also your business partner, proposes that you both invest in shared infrastructure, a new driveway, a joint fence, connected utility systems. Sounds reasonable until you read the fine print and discover that your neighbor wants 60% control over decisions, access to resources on your property, and the ability to veto any future arrangements you might make with other neighbors. That's essentially what Canada saw in Trump's proposal. According to the Canadian American Business Council's emergency analysis published this morning, the infrastructure partnership included what they term structural dependency clauses. The United States would control routing decisions for energy pipelines. The United States would have first refusal rights on critical minerals extracted from Canadian territory. The United States would chair the Joint Oversight Committee with veto power over major expenditures. Canada would be locked into exclusive partnership terms, preventing them from pursuing similar infrastructure arrangements with other nations for the duration of the agreement. The Fraser Institute, Canada's leading public policy research organization, ran the numbers. Under the proposed framework, Canada would contribute $840 billion over 10 years, but would surrender operational control over infrastructure that crosses Canadian territory. The data shows that 68% of the proposed pipeline networks would traverse Canadian lands but operate under U.S. majority governance. 73% of the critical mineral deposits targeted in the agreement sit in northern Canada, but extraction priorities would be set by Washington. The mechanism was clear. Trump wanted Canada to pay for infrastructure that would primarily serve American strategic interests while giving up sovereignty over their own resources. Let me be crystal clear. This wasn't a partnership proposal. According to former U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, who reviewed the documents for Bloomberg, this was a resource extraction framework disguised as infrastructure cooperation. Now, let me introduce you to the people who would have lived this reality. Sarah Bouchard, 52, owns a family mining operation in Sudbury, Ontario, that's been extracting nickel and copper for 3 generations. Her operation sits directly in one of the critical mineral zones identified in Trump's proposal. Under the partnership terms, according to the Mining Association of Canada, Sarah would have faced new extraction quotas set by the Joint Oversight Committee, meaning Washington bureaucrats would dictate how much she could mine, when she could mine it, and where it had to be sold first. She told CBC News yesterday that her operational costs would have increased by 37% due to new compliance requirements, while her ability to negotiate with international buyers, particularly in Asia and Europe, would have been restricted by the exclusive partnership clauses. Sarah faced an impossible choice: accept diminished sovereignty over her own business, or watch as larger U.S. yacht-backed operations received preferential treatment under the new framework. The devastating outcome was already clear. Her 3 children, all trained in mining engineering, had begun exploring opportunities in Australia and Chile, countries where mineral extraction doesn't come with sovereignty strings attached. Multiply Sarah's story by thousands of small and medium mining operations across Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, and you begin to understand why Canada's mining sector was the first to sound the alarm. Meet James Chen, 48, an energy infrastructure consultant based in Calgary, Alberta, who specializes in cross-border pipeline projects. James has spent 23 years building relationships with both American and Canadian energy companies, and he immediately recognized what the Trump proposal would mean for his industry. According to the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, the infrastructure partnership would have consolidated routing authority under U.S. control, meaning that pipelines carrying Canadian oil and gas would follow paths determined by American strategic priorities rather than Canadian economic interests. James calculated that his consulting business would see revenue decline by 41% because Canadian companies would no longer need his expertise in negotiating bilateral arrangements. Everything would be dictated from Washington. But here's the kicker. James also worked with Asian energy importers, particularly Japanese and South Korean firms interested in Canadian liquefied natural gas. Under the exclusive partnership terms outlined by the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, those relationships would have been effectively terminated. Canada couldn't pursue independent energy export arrangements without U.S. approval. James faced a devastating choice: restructure his entire business model around U.S.-dominated frameworks or exit the industry he'd spent 2 decades building. He told the Globe and Mail that he'd already been contacted by Norwegian energy firms offering positions in Europe, where energy sovereignty isn't negotiable. Let me introduce you to Michel Dubois, 61, who runs a water management cooperative in Manitoba that serves 17 rural communities. Michel's cooperative sits in the watershed region that Trump's proposal identified for integrated water systems management. According to the International Joint Commission, which has governed U.S.-Canada water issues since 1912, the new partnership would have superseded existing agreements and placed water allocation decisions under the Joint Oversight Committee. For Michel, this meant that communities she'd served for 34 years would suddenly have their water access determined by a body where American interests held majority control. The Pacific Institute's analysis shows that agricultural water usage in the affected regions would have decreased by 26% to accommodate American priorities for industrial and urban consumption. Michel faced an impossible reality: watch her community's water security become subordinate to foreign decision-making, or fight a legal battle against a framework backed by 2 national governments. The devastating outcome was already manifesting. 3 of her 17 communities had begun emergency consultations with provincial authorities about alternative water sources, despite the massive infrastructure costs involved. As Michel told the Winnipeg Free Press, "When your water security depends on another country's approval, you're no longer sovereign." Multiply her story by hundreds of water cooperatives across the prairie provinces, and you understand why Canada's agricultural sector mobilized against the proposal within hours of its details becoming public. And it gets worse. According to expert analysis published this morning, Canada's rejection wasn't just about saying no to Trump's terms, it was about revealing an alternative framework that exposes how dramatically the global economic landscape has shifted. The Royal Bank of Canada's International Economics team released a comprehensive breakdown of what they're calling Canada's strategic reorientation. In the next 30 to 90 days, Canada will announce a critical minerals partnership with the European Union that includes German, French, and Swedish technology firms. This arrangement, according to the European Commission's preliminary framework, will involve $1.2 trillion in investment over 8 years, with governance structures that guarantee Canadian sovereignty over extraction and processing decisions. Within 6 to 12 months, Canada plans to formalize infrastructure cooperation agreements with Japan, South Korea, and potentially India, focusing on energy export terminals and Arctic shipping routes. The Atlantic Council's Arctic Strategy Initiative notes that these arrangements specifically avoid the exclusive partnership clauses that define Trump's proposal, allowing Canada to maintain multiple strategic relationships simultaneously. But here's what really concerns analysts in Washington. Canada has been in quiet negotiations with China since November 2024 on a northern transportation corridor that would connect Canadian Arctic ports to Asian markets without routing through American-controlled infrastructure. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace obtained preliminary maps showing railway and pipeline networks that would make Canada significantly less dependent on U.S. export routes for accessing global markets. The expert validation is overwhelming and it's coming from unexpected sources. Former U.S. Ambassador to Canada Bruce Heyman told CNN that Trump's proposal represented the biggest miscalculation in U.S.-Canada relations since the War of 1812, describing it as a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern middle-power nations operate in a multipolar world. The Peterson Institute's senior fellow for trade policy stated that by demanding exclusivity and control, the United States essentially pushed Canada to accelerate partnerships it had been considering cautiously for years. Canada didn't reject American partnership, they rejected American dominance disguised as partnership. The Brookings Institution's analysis emphasized that Canada's response demonstrates how even traditionally aligned nations will refuse arrangements that compromise sovereignty, regardless of the economic incentives offered. According to their polling data, 71% of Canadians across all political affiliations supported their government's rejection of Trump's terms, representing rare national consensus in a typically divided political landscape. The Council on Foreign Relations noted that Canada's alternative framework, which includes the European Union, Asian partners, and potentially selective Chinese cooperation, actually offers better economic outcomes than Trump's proposal while maintaining Canadian autonomy over strategic decisions. And here's the timeline that should terrify Washington. Right now, as we speak, Canadian ministers are in Brussels finalizing critical minerals agreements that will be formally announced within 14 days. In the past 48 hours, Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry confirmed that negotiations with Canada on liquefied natural gas infrastructure have accelerated to high-priority status. Just this week, Australia and Canada announced they're exploring coordinated approaches to critical mineral extraction and processing, specifically to offer democratic alternatives to Chinese supply chains without surrendering sovereignty to American frameworks. According to the German Marshall Fund of the United States, what we're witnessing is the emergence of a middle power coalition that wants partnership with the United States, but not subordination to the United States. Canada's response isn't anti-American, it's pro-sovereignty, and that distinction matters enormously for how the international system evolves over the next decade. Let's recap the 3 critical points. First, Trump demanded Canada contribute $840 billion to infrastructure projects while surrendering operational control over their own territory and resources, a proposal that Canadian officials immediately recognized as structural dependency rather than genuine partnership. Second, the scale of Canada's rejection involves pivoting toward comprehensive economic arrangements with the European Union, Asian democracies, and potentially selective Chinese cooperation, representing a $2.7 trillion alternative framework over the next decade that maintains Canadian sovereignty while accessing global markets. Third, The permanent consequence is that the United States has demonstrated to its closest ally and arguably most reliable international partner that American partnership now comes with demands for control that even traditionally aligned nations find unacceptable, accelerating a global trend where middle powers choose diversified partnerships over exclusive alignment with Washington. If you found this analysis valuable, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is developing rapidly, and the implications for North American relations are just beginning to unfold. Here's what keeps me up at night. For 75 years, Canada has been America's most predictable ally, sharing the world's longest undefended border, deeply integrated economies, and common security frameworks. That reliability was built on mutual respect and recognition that partnership doesn't require subordination. Trump's infrastructure proposal and Canada's ice-cold rejection represent a watershed moment, not because Canada is abandoning the relationship, but because they're demonstrating that even the closest alliances have limits when sovereignty is at stake. When your most stable partner starts building alternative frameworks, when they're willing to complicate their economic relationships to preserve autonomy, when they'd rather negotiate with multiple powers than accept exclusive terms from one, it signals something profound about how the international system is reorganizing. Canada didn't just reject a proposal. They revealed that the era when American proximity guaranteed American primacy is over. And for policymakers in Washington still operating under old assumptions about how allied nations should behave, that's a wake-up call that can't be ignored. The question isn't whether Canada will remain an important partner, they will. The question is whether the United States can adapt to partnership models that respect sovereignty, or whether we'll keep pushing allies toward alternatives we won't control and might not like.